And hello once again, and welcome to the latest of these lecture series about various literature things. Today we're going to be talking about narrative mood with association with, not association, but through the concepts of Genette. Basically, there are three major things that he did, time, mood, and voice. Time is usually considered to be the one that's most robust, but narrative mood does add some interesting ideas with relation to focalization. Okay. So, before we get into that, I'm just going to quickly say, if you appreciate these videos that I do, and I've made a lot of them, you can check out my books, or you can also support me on Patreon. So, I'm going to move on from there, and let's just go straight into narrative mood. So basically, what is mood? Okay, mood is a bit of a weird word to use. Does it mean like the vibe? No. So, mood is the regulation of narrative information through the modalities of perspective and distance. Okay, cool, that sounds very, whatever. Okay, so what are these two things? What is perspective and distance? So basically, perspective, generally talking about focalization. Distance has to do with how close or how far you are from the text in different sense. So basically, you're either looking at it from a diegetic perspective or a mimetic perspective, the diegesis and mimesis. Alright, so diegesis is the idea of basically telling. It doesn't have any artifice. It's basically just, this is the information in the story, right? I'm just giving you the information. Strictly speaking, it's not the same as showing versus telling, but it's a good way to sort of see it, right? So think of that old famous thing. Do you show versus tell in a story? Do you just tell people the stuff, or do you show them the stuff? The reason it's a bit of a problem actually is because all narrative texts, if it's like a novel, right, all of them tell. You can't show, it's words. It is always telling. A movie can show. A book can't actually show. It can give the artifice of showing, but it's not actually showing. It can pretend to show. It gives the illusion of showing. You're having a mental image in your head, but it's told through words, so therefore it is still telling. But we're gonna sort of go away from that for a second. So diegesis, right, is telling. I'm just telling you the thing. I'm saying this is what is happening. It basically, it's no artifice, and it's called minimum of detail. You're not really giving that much detail. Mimesis is imitation. This is showing. So it's the imitation of reality, and it's more maximum of detail. Okay, cool. Now, when we're talking about focalization, in a very, very broad sense, it's basically made up of the perspective, or point of view, and the distance. So, is it showing or telling? Now, let's first go into distance before we go into the main thing of focalization, because focalization is really the predominant thing that you're going to be talking about if you're doing narrative mood most of the time in sort of an essay or something. So, cool, fun. Distance. What is distance? Distance is how far or how close you are to the text. Do you have the text through a narrative of words or a narrative of events? Generally, it'll be both, actually, but it could be one or the other. Okay, so basically, a narrative of words is something that is basically, it's directly quoted from the characters, right? You're directly copying a character's words or thoughts, right? This is very much close, okay? It is, it's sort of directly doing it. So think of like, in a story, direct quotes, right? That will be like this, sort of saying, this is exactly what the person is saying, or exactly what the person is thinking. Alright, it can be presented through diegesis or mimesis. It can be either shown or told. Versus a narrative of events, which is basically reported from characters, but not quoted directly from characters. So this could be more like saying, John saw blah 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 blah, rather than saying directly what John was thinking. You're sort of saying, John saw the people being, rounded up for the war, whatever it happens to be, right? That's reporting it. It's a narrative of events. I'm sort of giving you the event rather than saying the exact words. Whereas if it was saying, I was there and I saw them being taken away, that would be a narrative of words. It's sort of, it's quoting what the people are saying or thinking rather than actually showing it in that sense. Now this can either be directly presented or reformulated. So if it's directly presented, it'll be like direct speech, or it could be reformulated into something like indirect speech. And it gets a little bit hazy whether something is a narrative of words or a narrative of events. And that's why I wouldn't say it's necessarily that important to go into these in extreme depth when focalization is really the main thing here. But this is just sort of a way of thinking about narrative mood and how it can be formulated. Okay, now distance in general can be related to direct, indirect, and free indirect speech. Okay, that's in just general, right? So distance, think about it like a camera. Okay, you can zoom in on something, you can zoom out, right? So if you were to be doing something direct, so direct speech is directly quoting what a character says, or if something's in first person, kind of everything is direct, because they're sort of telling their own story. Okay, so it's directly given to you. Indirect, just as a quick, before I actually do continue with this, a quick thing just for those who are not as familiar with the concepts of direct, indirect, and free indirect speech. Direct speech would be something like, I want to go to the shops, said John. The I want to go to the shops is the direct speech. Or you could say, John said that he wanted to go to the shops. That is indirect speech. Or you could basically have a thing like, John had said that he wanted to go to the shops, and so he went to the shops and he walked there. That's free and direct. It's narration, right? So those are like the three things you could look at. Okay, is it either directly, is it indirectly, or is it basically the sort of third person in a sense, right? Is it sort of outside of the perspective of direct or indirect, and it's more disassociated, right? So how close is it? Are we seeing it closely, or are we seeing it from far away? That is the distance. And I also said here, where I said keep in mind that it's sort of an illusion that anything can be truly shown, which I've already sort of spoken about. Okay, so distance is important to understand mood, but mostly so that you can understand focalization and what focalization is. So, what is focalization? Just very, very broadly, focalization is the person who sees what is happening. Now you might think, oh, that's the narrator. No, not the narrator. The narrator is not the focalizer. They can be the focalizer, but they're not necessarily the focalizer. Okay? The focalizer is the person in the story who sees what happens. The narrator is the person who tells the story. They can be different. They're often the same, but they can be different, especially in postmodern texts. They can be different to one another. Okay, that is an important thing to keep in mind. Now, also, I don't really like the term sees. I prefer the term perceives, because sees, if you see something, it's implying a purely visual characteristic, whereas I would say perceive, which implies an understanding of the world, right? So, because see, if you see something, that doesn't take into account hearing, or smelling, or feeling, yet these are still aspects of the focalizer. So, I prefer they perceive the events, and then the narrator speaks those events. So the focalizer is basically that. It's the person who perceives things, which might, but also might not be a character in the story. If it's a first-person story, then generally the focalizer and the narrator are one and the same. Or what if it's a completely disjointed narrator who is essentially like an implied author? It's sort of just the person telling the story. They're not actually connected to the story. They're not in the story. They're just telling the story, right? They're still focalized. Okay, so what are the different types of the possibilities of focalization? Okay, focalization, remember, has to do with who perceives the events. So remember the whole thing with like distance, right? How close or how far is the focalizer? Are they close to the text? Or are they really, really far from the text? Are they in the text? This is where you get the idea of the different possibilities of focalization. Is the narrator larger than the character? Do they know more? So think about that. The narrator, if the narrator is omniscient, right? The narrator knows the thoughts of individual characters and knows everything that's happening. Then they're bigger than the character, which means that the focalization has to be larger than the character. If the narrator knows more than the character, the focalization has to know more than the character. Or you could say that the narrator is a character, in which case the focalizer is a character as well. Or you could say if the narrator knows less than the characters. Right, this happens a lot. This is like limited perspective. A purely omniscient narrator could just tell you the twist at the end of the story. Because they know the twist, they're omniscient. But what if the narrator doesn't know? What if the narrator doesn't know something that's happening with the characters? The narrator is telling you things, but doesn't actually know. So essentially, the focalizer is there perceiving less than what is actually known. Even if the character is the one telling the story, if the character knows less than what they're narrating, then they have a reduced focalization. Okay, so this is where you get then into the different types of focalization, where you get zero focalization / non-focalized, which is omniscient narrator, right? They know everything. And internal focalization is basically internal to the characters, like they can see inside their heads and stuff like that. External focalization, they're outside the characters. You could sort of see this as first person and third person, but also not necessarily, because you could still have an internal third person or an internal first person. But basically, think of it like that, right? Is it omniscient? How much perspective does it have? How much information does the narrator have access to? And how much of that information are they actually giving? That's the speaking part, right? The narrator can have more knowledge, but not be giving that knowledge, right? That is the kind of thing that can happen. That's why focalization and narration are not necessarily one and the same, because the narrator might know more than they're saying, which means that the focalization is larger and the narration is smaller. So that's why you can't just say focalizer is narrator. They can be separate from one another, but they can also be one and the same. Okay, so basically I'm just saying here as a final aspect of this is that there can be alterations in this, such as paralepsis and paralepsis and paralepsis. I know, very, very close. One is with an I and one is with an E, because a lot of these things are very irritating. So basically paralepsis is giving less information. Giving less information than is known. And paralepsis is giving more information. Well, not necessarily that is known, but giving less information versus giving more information. How much information is the narrator giving you? And also, how much information does the narrator even have access to? Which is an entirely different thing, right? The amount of information that the narrator has access to is the focalization, but the actual narration, how much they're telling, is different to that. Are they giving more? They're giving less information. Why are they giving more or less information? That is a very important thing to keep in mind when it comes to analyzing the mood in a text, right? How much information are we being given, and why are we being given that amount of information versus a different amount of information? Right? If you look at, say, like a minimalist text will hardly give you any information, whereas a maximalist text will give you a lot of, way more information than you need. But why are they doing that? Why is one giving you a little bit, one's giving you a lot? Why? What is the point of giving you a certain amount of information rather than a different amount of information? It's a bit of an annoying little thing, but this is mood in a very broad sense. And the last little thing here is that autobiographical texts also appear to be internal, but are actually external. This is a fun little thing. Okay. Autobiographical texts. Now, this also doesn't mean an actual autobiography. This can basically be a fake autobiography. I think a lot of stories are autobiographical. They're telling a story. Catcher in the Rye is one. It's sort of telling the story from the character's perspective, but it's sort of fictional character. It's just written in the same style as an autobiography. Okay, that is something to keep in mind when it comes to that. Now you might think, okay, well, obviously, the character who is narrating the story is the same character that's in the story, but that's not actually true. Not always. It can be. Think about something like Catcher in the Rye is actually a good example. Catcher in the Rye, there is the narrator, and there is the main character. They're the same person, but they're actually different characters. Because the narrator is recounting events that happened in the past, which means that they're actually a different person. They exist several months into the future, and they are recounting what they did when they were younger. When you are younger, you're actually a different person. Strictly speaking, your biology or whatever, you're the same physical human being, but you are a different person. When you look back on yourself as a teenager, you might be like, oh, wow, that was a completely different person to who I am now. And that's because that is how it works. You are a different person. You have grown. You have become something new. You have become something different. And that is because you do grow and change and adapt. So basically, an autobiographical narrative appears to be internal, right? It appears to be like within the story, like the character is speaking. But no, the character isn't necessarily speaking. The character is talking about a different version of themselves from an earlier point in time. Unless it's told in like the present tense, in which case then, yes, they are the same. So yeah, this is mood in narrative. Focalization is the primary thing you need to understand when it comes to focalization, or when it comes to narrative mood, because you just need to be able to understand how does this relate to the narrator. Now, the next video I'm going to be doing is about narrative voice, which goes more into narrator and character. You kind of need to see them as similar to one another. But that is, that's the end of this one for now. The next video will hopefully be helpful to whoever does also need that. And with that, I'm done. So, if you appreciate this, or the other kind of videos that I do and what have you, you can check out my books, or you can also support me on Patreon. Both these things are in the description. This is going to be my final year of videos about basically the unscripted videos about literary theory stuff. But I'm going to be doing the rest of everything that's basically in this particular subject. So it should be quite good, hopefully. So yeah, if you appreciate it, you can support me. And if you can't do the sort of monetary support, you can also, of course, do liking, subscribing, commenting. All of those things help. So yeah. Thank you very much, and I hope that you have a great day, week, and month ahead.